So we'll start off with some rapid questions, no more than 10 seconds per answer. First of all, would you want to know how and when you will die?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No, you live in dread then.
What euphemism about death do you dislike the most?
Sometimes on old headstones, you'll see that someone is sleeping.
Yes, okay. Now, which of the following jobs would you try for a day? Mortician, embalmer, or gravedigger?
Embalmer. You're left alone in the back room and it just seems like a, nice quiet job.
And a slightly different subject, what's your favorite horror movie?
Ooh, The Thing.
Okay. Which cemetery should everyone here visit at least once?
Highgate Cemetery in London. I live near it and it's beautiful.
I completely agree. And how would you like to be buried or not?
I'd like to be dissolved. There's a new form of cremation done by water
Okay, very ecologically sound.
and less violent.
Okay. Thank you for those. We're going to kick off the discussion talking about taboos. Now, tell us about your fascination with death. How did this start?
I was just a kid who had lots of questions. And I think if anyone has ever hung out with like a 5-year-old, you realize that all kids have lots of questions. But all of my questions about death, I realized, were being dodged by adults, especially the priests where I went to school. So as soon as I get like a vibe, like someone is trying to not tell me the truth, I become fixated on it and developed a kind of preoccupation with it. And then when I was 13, a friend of mine drowned, and I went to her funeral and became conscious of the fact that there was this whole group of people who had the answers to all of the questions I had. It was all of the people who were standing around the hearse and who were carrying the coffin. I realized that, she didn't just go from the creek where she drowned to the coffin in the church. There were all of these people in between. And so I kind of realized there was an industry and was really wanted to know what the hell was going on with that. And the good thing about becoming a journalist when you grow up is that you can ask questions. And if you say you're writing a book, people think that's really special. And they just invite you into the places where you think you're not supposed to go, like the back rooms in funeral homes.
And why do you think that death has become such a taboo subject for us?
You mentioned it briefly in the introduction, but in the 20th century, it became an industry. It used to be quite a neighborly thing. There'd be a woman in the neighborhood who usually took care of births and deaths. It was seen as, the bookends of life were women's business, really. But then funeral directors came in and embalming came in, and it became an industrial thing, and it was taken out of the home. And as a way of getting money out of people, they've kind of made it more mysterious. So we think that we can't be near dead bodies because they're dangerous or they're full of disease or they might harm us, which for the most part isn't true. But it really helps when the funeral director is trying to sell you things that have euphemistic names and you don't know what they are because it's all a mystery.
And euphemistically, we're talking about
Well, like
sleeping or...
sleeping, but also just basically, like they don't call it embalming anymore, really. They say, would you like the hygienic treatment? And you go, well, that sounds like something I should get. If I don't get that, it's probably gross. But it is embalming, and embalming is a thing where they are injecting fluid into the veins and arteries of a dead person and pushing the blood out. But they're not going to explain that to a grieving widow.
And do you think we have now become really quite alienated from death?
I think so. Just based on people's reaction to my book. I've ruined so many dinner parties by telling people what I'm writing about. But I've also found that once you open the discussion, people want to talk about it. I've done a few book signings and I found that each person who came up to the desk with a copy of my book wanted to tell me something they hadn't told anyone else before. about some experience with the dead body of their parent or their baby or something, and they've just been carrying this around, not saying it because they didn't want to ruin the dinner parties. And they found that, once I'd rolled out the carpet and said, "You're allowed," it all came out. Everyone's got a story.
And do you think the dignity of death has maybe to some extent disappeared because of the way that we try to nowadays push it away from us as individuals?
Not really the dignity, but maybe the meaning.
Yeah.
Like when I was doing my book, I spent time in funeral homes. And one funeral home in particular said, "Do you want to just spend the day dressing dead people for their coffins?" I thought when I asked to interview this funeral director that she would just, talk to me and then I'd say, "Can I see?" And she'd go, "No," because, we're programmed to think all of that is out of bounds and you will never see it. And I just happened to find this quite progressive funeral director who wanted people to see what went on in the back room. And she said, "No, we'll pretend like you're being trained to work here and you can help dress dead people for their coffins." And so I spent the day there, and
Wow.
these people were strangers to me. You get the little bag of clothes from the family, and as you're putting the clothes on, you can't help but kind of build a personality for this person. And it's really intimate. You're moving this person around, and they're not helping you. A dead person is so heavy. It's worse than trying to move a drunk person because they might help a bit. But I was putting his shoes on and I was doing up the laces, and it was really touching. It's like when you drop a kid off at the school gates and you make sure their laces are done before they run off. It's like the last thing you can do for someone. And I found it really meaningful with complete strangers. So now I've become, and now when my family dies, I will insist on being there. And that is something that has been removed from death. The idea that you can be there to dress your own family members because you think that it's an industry and you're not qualified. You're just dressing someone.
So that's quite extraordinary that you managed to spend a whole day in a funeral home.
Did you find that most of the people you were dealing with in the industry were
wanted to keep you at the distance?
Yeah, I had to prove my worth. And I don't blame them because, I'm a journalist and I have done a lot of arguing with my editors. And if you're writing about death, everyone wants something salacious as the headline, and they want something kind of crude and horrible because they think that's what will sell. So everyone in the funeral industry is, with good reason, kind of frightened of journalists. So I had to do months of character reference and begging and all sorts of things. But once I found one person who would then tell the next person she's a journalist, but she's okay, that kind of smoothed the tracks a bit.
So on this journey into the industry of death and the people that you met there, tell us a bit more about the other professions that you were dealing with as you were researching your book.
Well, I started out with this big, like detectives do in a TV show where they've got everything on the board of who they want to talk to. And it was all the people, there was the standard people, but then there were others that were like the crime scene cleaner and the mass fatality people. There's a whole team of people that fly in after lots of people die. And I spoke to them, but the one that sticks out to me was someone who was so hidden, I didn't even know that they existed until I started the process of the book. And this is a midwife who only delivers babies who have already died or won't live for very long outside the womb. And she's a normal midwife. She's trained for this moment, which is supposed to be joyous and full of life. And now she works in a hospital where she's trained for dead babies, and she's dedicated her life to it. And I met her, and within like 20 seconds, I had almost accidentally called her mum. She was so caring and warm. But she is part of this completely hidden part of an industry. And you don't meet someone like that unless you're about to lose your baby. And I think someone like that is heroic. And she's not the only one. There are hundreds of women like this. She was my favorite.
right?
Because it showed me, because I don't have kids, I've never lost a baby. But people who do become kind of exiled in the crowd, and they don't want to talk about, well, they can't talk about what they've gone through because no one really understands it. So these bereavement midwives, they're not just there for the event, they stick around in these people's lives because they were there when it happened. And if you've lost a baby, it's this weird grief where you're grieving someone who no one else met, who you barely knew. You're grieving a kind of potential rather than something solid. It's a strange thing. So it's it's kind of a therapeutic role as well as a practical one. And the fact that we don't know this goes on is horrifying to me.
How was that, and how do you feel about the death penalty?
So I found Jerry. He was the state executioner for Virginia for 17 years. I found him on a capital punishment abolitionist website. So I thought I should talk to him because he's gone through something. You don't just go from one stage to another. I found it completely fascinating because he was talking about his position as an executioner as something that he had been appointed to do by God. So any kind of questions about how he felt about it, he would just go back to it being, well, God asked me to do it and I am honored to do his work. But there were little things that kind of snuck out, like the fact that he never told his wife for the entire time he held the role. He never told his wife he was the executioner.
Wow.
The executioner isn't a full-time job. He's a prison warden, so he would go to prison every day. But his wife wouldn't know that one day he was going to go and kill someone. So there was that he had to carry. He said he did it because the stuff he was carrying, he didn't want her to have to carry that as well. And also he said that on the day of an execution, he couldn't look at himself in the mirror because he didn't want to see himself as the executioner. So even though he had kind of built up this mental scaffolding to allow himself to carry out this work, it was clearly getting to him in a way that he then campaigned against the death penalty.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. I don't think anyone has the right to kill anyone else.
Thank you. Lady here.
Would you say that the people who work in the funeral industry, like funeral directors, embalmers, are they strange, creepy people, or are they normal, kind people like anyone else?
The ones I met are really normal and also funny. I don't know why it's like they've seen the worst thing that can possibly happen. And so every like minor bullshit kind of doesn't get to them. They're really fun to go to the pub with. And they go for hours and they are full of really, really dark jokes. I really like them. I interview like famous movie stars. I write for GQ magazine, and I would much rather be stuck in a bar with funeral directors than actors.
Wow. So not taking the question about the weirdness of potentially of some of the people you met, but actually what are the weirdest rituals around death that you encountered, maybe that you hadn't been aware of before?
Well, there are beautiful things that happen around the world that are weird. Like in Indonesia, there is this one town where every year they pull the bodies out of their tombs and take the clothes off them, clean them, put more clothes on them. They light cigarettes for them.
Wow.
And then they put them back in their tombs. And I think, that is a bit closer to death than even I would want to be. But I do think the weirdest tradition is one that we do. We embalm people. I went into this book with, if anyone's read Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death, it's a very judgmental, kind of bitchy book about the American funeral industry, and the thesis was that the American funeral industry is preying on the vulnerable and making them pay for things they don't need. So I went into this thinking that embalming was something we don't need. And then I learned that, in a mass fatality situation, like if there's an earthquake or a tsunami, when they send in the emergency response team, they will send embalmers with that team as well, because those bodies need to be transported to another country. So there is like a practical need for embalming. But I think the weirdest tradition, Indonesia and all of this stuff aside, the weirdest tradition is embalming someone so that they look like they're sleeping and preserving them so that they will remain looking like that under the ground for months after they have been buried. I just think that is bizarre. Because all of those chemicals are then going into the ground, into the groundwater, and, you know, it's poisoning the earth, it's poisoning the worms. It's just generally quite bad.
Before we come to the next question here, if you have a question, put your hand up, and I'm sure someone with a microphone will take your question shortly. But actually, I suppose this is maybe rather more personal for you. How did this quest into the industry of death, how did that affect you personally?
I was really personally affected by, I went into the room, the basement in the hospital where they do autopsies, and I was fully prepared for an adult autopsy, and that's what I was there to watch, but it happened to be a pediatric department as well. So I saw a baby's autopsy, and this baby was there for forensic reasons. They were trying to find out if the mother had killed it. And for months afterwards, I was just completely, I went to bed. It was a really weird thing because I was beside this baby and I couldn't save it. Even though I knew it was dead, it was this weird, illogical, emotional reaction. And that part of going to find the bereavement midwife was me trying to figure out why I felt that way and what I could do with these emotions. So it was a far more emotional book than I was expecting, because as a journalist, you think you can kind of stand there and report on things and you can be outside of it. But the thing with death is that it's so personal. Even if it's not your loved one's dead body, it is so personal. And so I came out of this like fundamentally changed. But probably the most like practical thing is that there is a level of stuff I can't be bothered with. I can't be bothered arguing on the internet with someone who's a bit wrong. Like, just let it slide. I get really sentimental about things and I keep things, and you know, I try and cherish people while they're here, because I've seen what happens when people aren't, and it's very quick.
Very interesting. The lady over there, I think, hi.
Yes. Hello, hi. So I would have actually two questions. So one would be like, what's your experience? How does one end up working in the death industry? I'm like, other than continuing probably a family business. And the second one would be like, what did you experience people working in the industry think about life after death, consciousness? So what happens after that?
I found that the people I spoke to, they weren't from a family of funeral directors. They came to it all for different reasons. And there was one lady who she had been working as like at an art auction house, and it was just like dealing with rich people and money, and she was like, this is meaningless. So she wanted to do something in her life that meant something, and she wanted to either work in birth or love, you know, do something with weddings or deaths. It was just the important things in somebody's life. So she didn't even mind which one she ended up in. And now she runs a funeral home with lots of different homes around London. And she did that because she had come down with some kind of illness, and she herself was about to die. And she was horrified by the fact that because we don't talk about death at all, she was being forced to face the fact that she was about to die and about to go into, you know, a funeral home or something, and she had no idea what was going to happen. And she said it was like if she'd been 9 months pregnant and she'd never seen a baby before. Wow. And so she now not only runs a funeral home, but she does talks around London, and death cafes where you can go and talk about your feelings around death. And I've forgotten your second question.
Yeah, so what do people working in the industry think about what happens after that?
Generally, I found that unless you're very religious, most people go, when you're dead, you're dead. And because when you see a dead body, it's very dead. And they're quite, you know, hard line on that. I didn't really meet anyone who had any airy-fairy ideas. If you do think, you know, there are ghosts and things, I don't think you could work in a funeral home with all of those people there.
So if I can maybe continue then on that theme, tell us about cryonics and your visit to the Cryonics Institute.
So the cryonics is the freezing of dead bodies so that they can be reanimated in the future, is what happened to Fry in Futurama and Austin Powers. And I thought I was going to go there and meet crazy people, and that would be like a fun end to my book. And I actually, like, I'm not pro cryonics, but now I'm like, don't mock them, because I went there and they said, you know, we don't even think this will work. And I was shocked. I thought I was going to go and they were going to say, yeah, this is amazing, this is the future. And they said, no, we have no idea. But we know what happens if you put a body in the ground. We know what happens if we put it in the fire. We are the experimental group. And while they're experimenting in the freezing of dead bodies, they're kind of helping the medical industry with the freezing of organs. They're putting money into research. And as a byproduct, if they ever do reanimate bodies, that's kind of like, yay, but they're not expecting it to happen. I just loved how optimistic they were. They were kind of like, yeah, in the future, we will have figured everything out. I read the book that was written in the 60s by a guy called Robert Ettinger. And it was all about, you know, it was kind of light on the science, because in the future they'll figure that out. But he went into like, what will happen if you are reanimated, if you're defrosted, and you have several wives who died in the time of your being alive, and they're all defrosted at once. And it's he basically put forward an idea for polyamory. He's like, in the future, monogamy is out. And so I really liked his reasoning. But yeah, cryonics is, it's not crazy people. It's just like science fiction fans doing something fun. And it's a mad place where they have these giant, it's like a thermos, and you are hung upside down like a bat inside it because it's filled with liquid nitrogen. And they said that if the liquid nitrogen leaks out, they want the last thing ruined to be your head, because they figure they can make you a new toe in the future, but your brain is who you are, so they want that kept fine. And they do embalming, the same thing, that, you know, the pushing of the blood out of the veins, but they're putting something different into the body. It's a kind of antifreeze, but it doesn't puff the body up like embalming does. It actually shrinks it. So they basically take a grape and they make a raisin. And the bodies end up looking a bit bronzed and mummified, and that's when they put them in the sleeping bag and then put them face down in the tanks.
Well, on that upbeat note, really grateful if you could all put your hands together and give Hayley a round warm of applause.
Thank you.